So the monitoring and evaluation of climate communication education project, otherwise known as the MECCE project, is a 6-year research policy partnership funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And it's led by Professor Marcia McKenzie, who's also joining us today. The MECCE project is a collaboration with over 80 partners to improve understandings of what constitutes quality climate change education and communication, while also addressing the lack of robust national, regional, and international data available for intergovernmental and governmental target setting and progress monitoring. The purpose of the MECCE project, of this virtual seminar series, is to explore topics of relevance to the MECCE project, including knowledges, methodologies, policies, and practices related to climate change education and communication. Today's webinar will be focused on the issue of indicators for climate impact. Indicators can be powerful tools for fostering awareness and change in climate communication and climate education, and for action on environmental sustainability. They can convey information about climate-related commitments, efforts, and activities to a wide range of stakeholders. They can help global, national, and local policymakers and NGOs to establish benchmarks, set measurable targets, and monitor progress. And they can support greater transparency about past resource allocations and contribute to discussions about directing future efforts and resources. To ensure that indicators address the concerns of diverse groups and promote positive impacts, critical reflection and knowledge sharing is needed both during their development and during their utilization. This MECCE project webinar will stimulate discussion about these issues with 2 presentations followed by audience participation and interaction. We are absolutely delighted to be joined by Mr. Albert Motivans from the Equal Measures 2030 project and from Mr. Augustine Kenduiwo from Kenya's Ministry of Environment and Forestry. So before we get started, just a few minor housekeeping items. As you may have seen, we're recording this seminar in order to share it on the MECCE YouTube page. And we would ask that you keep your microphones and videos muted because we have people joining from many different parts of the world, and that helps to preserve our bandwidth. Our 2 speakers will each present for about 15 minutes, and then we'll move to audience interaction. We would like to make this an engaging opportunity for mutual learning and kindly request that you write your questions to the speakers in the chat box. During the interaction, please use the hand raise function to speak, and I'll call on you to unmute your mic in order to ask your question. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker. Albert Motivans is Head of Data and Insights for Equal Measures 2030, a civil society and private sector-led data and advocacy initiative. Albert develops innovative approaches to generate, analyze, and visualize development data, and to build skills and capacities to support data use and lead to better policies and outcomes. Drawing on his many years with UNESCO's Institute for Statistics, Albert brings extensive experience in data research and development and data communication, visualization, and analysis to his work at Equal Measures 2030 and to a range of global technical panels, task forces, and advisory groups that he is a member of. Today, Albert will share experiences of working with civil society, researchers, policymakers, and others on localizing a diverse set of indicators on gender equality to promote change across the Sustainable Development Goals. He will explore the development of tools for communicating data on gender equality to reach different audiences, the use of tools to assess the skills and knowledge of potential users, and approaches for integrating demand-side perspectives to achieve greater impact. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us, Albert, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Aaron, for the introduction. Let me just get the PowerPoint going here. You can see the opening slide. Yep. Okay. Great. So it's really a pleasure to be here and to talk to you. I talk to a lot of different constituencies in my work, and I think there's a lot that we have in common, and there's common challenges, common issues, and I hope that even though I'm talking about related issues around the SDGs, that you'll find things that are pertinent for the MECCE project, and we've been already in the place where you are now. So we're kind of have that luxury of looking backwards and providing some of the lessons that we've had along the way. I think MECCE has got a great start. So I think a real strength of the project is that it's interdisciplinary to begin with. So you're bringing together different constituencies together that have different strengths, different perspectives, different sources of data. And I think that's by design already. I think that's a big advantage. I think oftentimes constituencies are looking a little bit too much inwards and not seeing the innovation and the leverage and the mobilizational potential of looking outside the sector. So I think just to start, I think that's a really interesting design. So as Aaron mentioned, we're kind of a global to local partnership. So we have some really big partners like Gates Foundation, KPMG, Plan International, One Foundation, and then regional partners as well that support us. But we're really looking at kind of accountability on gender issues across the SDGs. So this includes then some of the environmental goals as well. So in our work, we're probably dealing most with SDG 13 around environment. But again, what we're trying to do, and I'll talk a little bit more about our index, but what we're trying to do is to kind of link that global data to action on the ground. And that's, I think, a lot of what I want to talk about. And we're working with grassroots organizations in 7 countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia as part of that work. And I think I'll talk about a little bit more about that connection. So just to say something about the index, and I think an index is an interesting kind of thing to think about for MECCE, as well. So I think kind of learning from what else is happening and what maybe some of the trade-offs and challenges are around communicating the MECCE monitoring framework. So our global index was first released in 2019, and we're right in the middle. In fact, we just shared our draft report for our new index, which is coming out in 2022. The new design, and we've worked with the Joint Research Council in European Union to audit it for methodology and technical robustness. It covers 144 countries and 56 gender issues. So already there's something common with MECCE. I think I saw that the indicator or data set list is around 55. Now maybe there's more indicators. Maybe that's 55 data sets, but a large amount of data, right? So how across different domains, and I think that's one reason why a composite indicator is helpful, because it can summarize some of that information for communication, by domain or over the MECCE framework entirely. And that's what we try to do. So we try to apply this gender lens across 14 of the 17 goals and come up with a global index number, but then also data that covers each of the goals, and then providing the data for the underlying indicators that make up those goals as well. So what we add is this gender lens. So if you look at the SDGs now, there's some nod to gender equality and inclusion, but a lot of the data aren't available or aren't reported or aren't reaching a sufficient coverage for analyzing globally. So there's still a lot of issues there. So what we try to do is try to fill in the gaps. You can see a lot more on our website. I'll share the links at the end of the presentation, but we have a number of data visualizations that we use to kind of benchmark countries, by indicator, by goal and region. And what we're adding in the new index is the ability to benchmark over time. So you'll be able to compare 2015 to 2020. And for our audiences, that's something that's really important to be able to talk about being on track, off track, falling behind, progressing well. I think it really opens up a lot of entry points for messaging. As you can see if you can see, it's kind of small, but the table at the bottom of this slide, is kind of showing that, and these are the kind of the top countries for gender equality by individual goal. And you can see a lot of green there, but you can see green in the, in the lower numbered goals. So around public provision, education, health, and so on. But you do see yellow and red. So it's kind of showing, by showing this big picture, we're able to say that, okay, well, some countries do have high scores in gender equality, but they're not good at everything. There's gaps in certain goals, certain domains that that still need to be looked at and addressed and probably raised in terms of its profile. And you can see 13 there, for example, on the right. It's kind of small. It's just the third from the left. A lot of yellow in the most developed countries in the world. So it really is a universal issue. And again, we're talking about gender equality as reflected through climate change. So what is the impact on women and girls and gender equality through the climate change goal? So you can see there's a lot of work to do, and countries are not scoring well on this measure. So I think that's something that's really nice about the big picture. And again, thinking about the MECCE work, whether there's a way to to be able to summarize overall progress, but at the same time retain some level of granularity. And this isn't a great deal of granularity, right? We're not able to look intersectionality or looking at specific groups of women and girls, but at least it's a kind of a first step and a way to kind of identify where the big problem areas might be. Of course, this depends on data coverage, and that's probably an issue for MECCE as well, is whether the data are available to support a tool like this. But just to say, like, a composite indicator doesn't have to cover all domains. You could even cover one domain where you do have the data and kind of use that tool in that way. And I think what's strong about using there's trade-offs, and coming from, as Aaron mentioned, I'm coming from a data production background, where I was always very dismissive of composite indicators because I thought, why should I give away my analytic power? What's that for me? And I think that's something that's important to think about in terms of audiences, is that for some audiences, it's the communication is the more important aspect of the data. And I think for me as an analyst, it's not sufficient because I want to be able to look at the components. I want to know more quickly what's happening underneath. But for communication, it's very powerful. And I presented our index results, and I was very proud of the impact we had made at a recent conference. And I was on a panel with other social indices, and we all had the same story. I mean, these kinds of tools really get traction and really get a lot of attention. And so there's that trade-off there between the technical side and the communication side. But as a communication tool, I found it to be more powerful than expected in terms of reaching different audiences. But there's also other ways to present the data. And I think we've been trying to do that because we also want to reach not only a kind of a technical or policymaker audience, but also, our kind of our main partner, which is women's rights organizations, grassroots organizations, which are, often not always using kind of data tables, or, they're kind of looking for other kinds of ways to express data. And here, what we've done with this application that's on our website now is really being able to see yourself in the SDGs. So you would start by giving your age and the country that you're living in, and then choosing an issue which is important to you. And you can see here the results is, I will be in my 60s by the time women in Italy are equally represented in senior government positions if current trends continue. So it kind of brings the issue of women's representation and power, to yourself, and not only to yourself, but I mean, I've done this for our children, and for others, to see what what the future looks like if there's no change. So presenting it in this way, I think is a nice way to complement the technical side, and I think it's a way of kind of reaching more audiences, or reaching a wider audience. So just a few observations, from the work that we've done. Some of these are, I think, pretty obvious. I'm not inventing anything new here, but they're just kind of basic principles, which I think have been really important for our work, and I think have shaped the way we kind of look at issues now. And one is just knowing your audience, right? So if MECCE is really focused on policymakers, then it's really about delivering the kinds of products and the kind of information in the form that they want or that they use. But I wouldn't overestimate that. And I wouldn't overestimate their knowledge of these issues. So we did a quiz of policymakers, and you can find a similar quizzes on other sites. For example, the Gapminder site has a really nice quiz on perceptions of development and and what is a developing country, and how much progress we've made or haven't made. But we did that with policymakers, and they really were not able to say, for example, or even come close to, under kind of having an idea of, for example, the labor force participation rate of women, wildly different kind of ideas. And these are persons who are working on these issues. So I think that's kind of important to kind of know the audience and, kind of tailor that data for them. I don't know if this is so relevant for you, but I run a lot of this in talking to constituencies about, they say, well, we don't have any profile because we don't have a lead indicator. We don't have a catchy indicator. We don't have an SDG indicator. Well, I guess MECCE does have some SDG indicators. But I think, sometimes, the perfect, the perfect can't be the obstacle to the good. And I think there is a lot of, good things that are out there. And I think it's great that the SDGs focus on outcome indicators, because that's where we need to push countries to better measure outcomes. But there's a lot more that policymakers and stakeholders need. There's the context, and the context for MECCE is, really diverse and complex and interesting, and shape a lot of, what attitudes and behaviors around environmental practices are. So it's trying to, better capture that whole environment, or that whole context, or, some of the other issues that come up. I know that legal frameworks are an important issue for MECCE, and, I'll come back to that in a moment, but I think, or maybe I'll just go ahead and say that now, legal frameworks matter a lot from what we've seen. So, having a normative basis for your indicators, where there's something that has to be done, or the government has committed itself to doing, like the SDGs, but also like local labor law or local environmental laws, it's really an important entry point. And we find that as a way to really reach, policymakers that, this is important because you're being held accountable for it. So you should be paying attention to these indicators.
2 minutes.
Sorry?
2 minutes, Albert.
Sorry? Oh my goodness. Okay, so I'll move a little bit quicker. So I'll just say that, I'll segue into the next issue I wanted to talk about, which is, we had to be careful about supply-driven indicator exercises, right? That this machine descends from the heavens with the indicators for your good. That's really not how it works. And, I'm exaggerating a lot there, but, it really is important to talk to your users, to talk to the policymakers about what's important to them, what kind of information they need, to make decisions, what kinds of issues that they're being held accountable for, to really inform that index, and so that, or not the index, but the indicators, so that they're used. I think the barrier to that is that it's hard. It's an effort. You really need to make an effort to reach and talk and engage with your users and the demand side. But I tell you that the payout is huge, and I'll talk. Maybe I'll segue to that now. Just one quick point is, around asking people directly about attitudes and behaviors. We see this more and more in the SDGs. For example, the food insecurity and other SCG indicators are using polling data, from Gallup. And I think it kind of, when you think about, whether you should go and estimate food production, how much flour was produced and make assumptions, modeling about consumption versus just asking someone, were you hungry last week? I think it's a powerful way to kind of get to some of the results that you want quicker. So let me move on to the other part I wanted to say, which is really about localizing, some of these measures. And this is a quote of which I really love from one of our respondents to one of our surveys that we did of our users, broadly gender advocates. And she said, "Stories moved me, but data changed me." And I think it's so powerful because this is a person who is the storyteller. This is the one person with authentic ground truths, who's working on the ground, mostly in qualitative kinds of approaches, but who really understands the context and the issue, but had struggles in communicating those stories to policymakers. And when linked to some of the tools around some of the data and the language that policymakers speak, suddenly doors opened, and she was really able to make greater impact with her work, bringing the two together. And so if your audience is policymakers, you can flip this around. You can say, well, data moved me, but stories changed me. And bringing in some of these stories around some of these issues, is a great way to kind of, really change policymakers. And just to give an example of that, this is one of our partners in Kenya. This is Groots Kenya, which we've worked with now for 3 years. They had so they're a grassroots women's network, and they did their own data collection. So they did citizen-generated data in a largely rural county in Kenya, and they were focusing on clean energy. And they found that 2/3 of families use firewood for their cooking in the kitchen, and they looked at health impacts on women and children through the data collection, and the time use. So who was exposed most to the pollution, and they found that awareness was high. So people knew about clean and efficient cook stoves and the use of other sources of energy, but there was significant cost barriers. But somehow that was not getting to the policy level. So they took this evidence to public hearings, and they were able to change things at the county level, so that there was then investments made in clean, new technologies, clean cooking stoves, and further training and promotion at the government level. So I just want to say this, for me, sometimes when I was at UNESCO and I heard sustainable development, and it seemed to be everything and anything, but a story like this for me tells me exactly what sustainable development is. It's really, kind of a powerful way to kind of express those concepts. So my last slide is just about, kind of thinking about these partnerships, and creating the enabling environment, because I think we should, could also look out at, civil society partners. There's many youth groups active in environmental issues. There's women's groups, for example, Groots Kenya is clearly already doing many things in this field. So thinking about that, whether that's something that works in the model, as an indirect way to policymakers and change, is like also having civil society organizations, making your messages around, around the need for, better teaching and learning around environmental issues. And just to touch, I'm probably out of time, but just to say one of the issues that's come up, in kind of like researchers and policymakers and civil society getting together, is that we really come from different spaces and we really value knowledge differently. And it's kind of really important to recognize, those different values, in the partnership. Partnership is really difficult. And as I said before, this is, not a simple exercise. It really takes effort, but again, it's worth it. And there's, opportunities across the data value chain. So it might be data collection, but it might be data communication. It might be, some other element around, going from production to then, the impact on the ground. But this temperature on the right-hand side was instigated by a comment from an advocate who said, "Oh, but we're so hot. We really want it. We're high temperature. We want to get there. Convince the policymakers to change. And the statisticians are so cold. We don't talk the same language. We want to move and change. And statisticians want to say, well, no, you need to you need to be careful, whatever, interpret the number this way. So it's kind of finding that middle ground and actually communicating then those, those needs about rigor, about making change on the ground and what it takes, to kind of negotiate that in what you're doing. So I'll stop there. Sorry if I went over a little bit. Just leave a few links for some of the tools that you can find on our website.
Thank you so much, Albert. A lot of interesting material that you covered. We had a couple questions that came up in the chat box that I just want to recognize, but I think we'll need to come back to them after we've allowed our second speaker to make a presentation. One has to do with the issue of most of the data on gender that you present does not include, let's say, gender minorities. These would be, let's say, groups that are either, trans people or non-binary, or maybe you just confirm that, and whether or not there are any sources of information that actually might address the concerns of gender minorities. That was one question that came up. And the other is a question of bottom-up indicators, or indicators that speak a little bit more to the gap between, the vision and mandate of programs or policies on the one hand, and what actually happens on the ground, and the relative value of, let's say, bottom-up indicators. So we'll come back to these, just so you know, these are the two questions that came up in the chat box. Very good questions. And at this point, I'd like to move then to our second speaker. I'm delighted to present Mr. Augustine Kenduiwo, who's the Deputy Director of Climate Change in charge of climate change mitigation, and was previously in charge of climate change information and knowledge management in Kenya. Augustine holds a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture and a master's degree in environmental planning and management, and brings over 28 years of experience working in the public sector on matters having to do with agriculture, climate change, including green growth and circular economy. Augustine is an alumni of Denmark's Danita Fellowship Center, a center that supports sustainable development and equal opportunities through training and learning programs, collaborative research, and knowledge sharing. Today, Augustine will be discussing Kenya's national climate change learning strategy and its links with Kenya's monitoring, reporting, and verification plus system. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Augustine, and thank you very much for joining us from Nairobi.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you very much, colleagues, for joining us this evening. My presentation is basically centered around our journey as a country in developing the national climate change learning and awareness strategy. The strategy is a 10-year strategy, and it runs from 2021 to 2030. Yeah, that's the presentation that I'm making this afternoon. So the strategy has a vision. It has a strategy, strategic objectives. It has a vision that our vision in the strategy is to have a citizenry equipped with relevant knowledge and skills provided by national education and training institutions to drive Kenya's economy to a low emissions, carbon resilient development pathway in a sustainable manner. This vision is actually derived from a very intense consultative process that we undertook while we were developing the learning strategy. The strategy also has 5 priority sectors. We centered on education, environment, energy and transport, water, irrigation and sanitation, and also agriculture. The reason why we centered on these strategic priority areas is because they are linked to our national climate change action plan, which is a plan that drives change actions in the country. We have 3 cross-cutting areas: public awareness, capacity building, gender, and youth engagement. So if I can delve into the process itself, we started this process through a stakeholder analysis, which was done through a commissioning of a consultant. This was done to analyze the stakeholders that are key in the process of developing this strategy. and a background report was actually developed. And then from there, we set our vision and strategic priorities, as I just mentioned earlier. Then we went ahead and developed our learning needs assessment to ascertain what is it that which areas we need capacity, and what is required. What indicators do we think we need to see along the way as we implement the strategy? So learning needs assessment came up now with the learning action plan, where we now developed the implementation framework, and then the M&E framework to actually monitor the implementation of the strategy. So this was done through a series of multi-stakeholder and cross-sectoral consultations. We had the civil society organizations, the ministries, government ministries, the private sector were also on board, just to ensure that we didn't leave anyone behind. And then this process was driven by a task team that was put in place by the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, where I work. This technical task team comprised of representatives from critical stakeholders, including government, national education and training institutions, private sector, civil society, and development partners. We had food and agriculture organization on board, plus other development partners that joined us. The team provided valuable technical expertise and guidance throughout the process and in all elements relating to the strategy. We were looking at the reports that were being developed by a consultant that was brought on board. We were able to validate the reports that were there, the expert input that the stakeholders were giving for data collection and analysis. Our next step now was to define the learning action, and therefore this is an area where we were now identifying the indicators for tracking the action. And during this learning action process, a number of stakeholders convened several or numerous consultations. The aim of these consultations was to enhance skills of participants to design results-based action to enhance climate change-related learning. These stakeholders consultation meetings also identified learning needs and sustainable learning approaches in selected priority sectors, which I mentioned earlier on. Develop specific learning interventions responding to professional priority needs, develop results-based actions to strengthen individual and institutional capacities to deliver climate change learning, and explore modalities and partnerships for implementing the proposed action. After defining our learning action plan through the stakeholder consultations, we now developed our implementation and M&E frameworks. The picture you're seeing there is a number of us, stakeholders, who are really working so hard to develop the learning actions and also developing the M&E, the monitoring and implementation framework. So this is the team that developed the learning strategy. So the implementation framework involves responsible and cooperating institutions in implementing the specific actions that are identified within the learning strategy. And the monitoring and evaluation centered on national learning strategy for impacts, the strategic priorities for outcomes, and the actions or outputs for actions for outputs and the individual activities. So if we could look at the indicators that we came up with during the consultative process, there were both qualitative and quantitative variables that included the baselines, the status of the indicator at the beginning of our project. The team, the stakeholders that were working on this document really had to crack their minds and looked at what are the baselines on the actions that we were proposing, what are the targets which we hope to achieve by the end of the project, and what are the means of verification, how the data for the indicator is collected on a regular basis, example surveys, reports. So our discussion on indicators centered around that. And then if I can give you a few examples of the indicators that we developed in the learning strategy, I'll go to education, the priority sector on education. We identified priority actions like integrate climate change into curricula at all levels of education and training, including local and indigenous knowledge. That is a priority action that we identified within that particular sector. And then we identified the expected outcome to be climate change integrated into curricula at all levels of education and training. This outcome is currently lacking, but we expect to see that outcome if we put in place the activities that we want to undertake. And then for the indicator for that particular priority action, the number of guidelines developed and adopted to mainstream climate change into curricula at all levels of education and training by June 2023. That was our key performance indicator for that priority action. And then we have activities like develop guidelines to mainstream climate change into curricula at all levels of education and training, train curriculum developers to integrate climate change into curricula at all levels of education. So all these activities will be monitored for implementation through the key performance indicators, and we are able to come up with our expected outputs, which will give us our expected outcome, and then it will mean then that our priority action has actually been met. So our next one is the same cross-cutting area, being public awareness, and a priority action being enhance the National Climate Change Resource Center as a one-stop shop for climate change information relevant to Kenya. This is for the awareness side. The other one was obviously for the climate change strategy. This is the awareness side. And under the awareness side, we propose that we have our National Climate Change Resource Center as a country, and then this resource center should be enhanced according to this strategy to be a center that offers a one-stop shop for climate change information relevant to Kenya. We have an expected outcome there, we have expected output, we have key performance indicators, and we have activities that will move our implementation across the expected indicators, the output, the outcome, until you get into the implementation of the actions, or the outcome of the actions. So this climate change learning strategy and learning and awareness strategy will be linked to our MRV system within the Climate Change Directorate. The Climate Change Directorate is a directorate in Kenya that is mandated to oversee and implement all climate actions within the country. And therefore, we have developed, as a climate change directorate, we have developed our measurement, the reporting and verification plus system, where now the climate change learning strategy will feed their results into the MRV system, which will be analyzed by within the system, and the system now will be able to generate information regarding what has actually transpired within the climate change learning space. So from there, this MRV system from the Climate Change Directorate will now be linked to our national and the county. We have got two levels of government in Kenya. We have the national government and we have the county government. So in the national government, we have our national plans, and in the counties, we also have our county integrated development plans. In the national government, we have what you call the medium-term plan. So the information generated from the MRV within the Climate Change Directorate will now be fed into the National Integrated Monitoring System and the County Integrated Monitoring Systems for purposes of now mainstreaming the climate action that have been identified within our national planning. Of course, we cannot say we were very smooth in running this agenda. We had challenges that we encountered through the process. One of the challenges was difficulty in accessibility of baseline data, including sex disaggregated data. So it's very, very difficult to access some of this baseline data. There was also low capacity on indicator development among the stakeholders, lack of sufficient resources to build capacity of stakeholders on developing smart indicators. So you find most of them have never been taken through the process of really developing some of these indicators. We also had competing interests of stakeholders. So you have to manage these within the discussions that took place within the consultative forums. Cutting timely input due to tight timelines. Remember, we were working within the COVID era, and it was really very difficult. So we just had to really, try our level best. COVID-19 measures made it a logistical challenge to engage stakeholders in remote areas because of lockdowns. We were unable to travel, but nonetheless, when there was a window of traveling, we were able to travel. This process was to take 1 year, but we ended up taking 1.5 years to complete because of those challenges that I've just mentioned. We started in March 2020 and were supposed to finalize in around the following March 2021, but we extended up to around September 2021. On top of the challenges, I can say we are proud to mention a few achievements. The buy-in from all stakeholders on the importance of climate change, learning, and capacity building as a foundation of climate action. This was one of the greatest achievements that I saw myself, and I think we realized that involving everyone on board from the word go actually increases ownership of actions that have been identified, and therefore it will increase implementation of the same across board, both within civil society, government or public institutions, and also the private institutions. Engaging the youth as co-stakeholders of the strategy development process, including indicator development, was also a very good success because we involved quite a number of young people in this process, and they are able to identify their input within the process. Cross-sectoral engagement throughout, measurement of performance of organization tied to national reporting system. That's another very good success. Collection of sex disaggregated data as a core part of MNE. This will enable monitoring the impacts of intervention for both women and men, girls, and boys. So I think that brings me to the end of my presentation. I just want to end there. I hope I was within the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Augustine. Such an interesting perspective, and congratulations on so much of the work that you and your colleagues have been organizing in Kenya in this area. Much to be learned. I want to remind all the participants that we very much look forward to questions that you might have for either of the two speakers, and we would kindly invite you to place your questions in the chat box. I am going to turn it over to our first speaker in just a moment, but I did have, since we haven't seen quick questions for the second presentation, I did have two quick questions that Augustine might consider when I turn it over to him for his response. One is whether or not he was able to identify a preference, depending a little bit on the stakeholders and the target audiences, between the use of more quantitative indicators and more qualitative indicators. Is there some kind of a preference that he could identify in terms of which particular stakeholders seem to be more amenable to quantitative or qualitative, or are both kinds of indicators perceived to be equally important? And secondly, since much of the focus in Kenya is on the 6 ACE elements, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about if any of the particular ACE elements were especially challenging in terms of developing data streams or data sources and potential indicators. You gave examples from formal education at the kind of primary, secondary level and public awareness. I wonder if any of the other ACE elements you found to be especially challenging, and what solutions you may have come up with in order to address them. So with that, I'd like to go back to Albert and give him an opportunity to address the two questions that had come up in the chat box previously. And if there are any other questions that people have for Albert, please place them in the chat box at this point. Albert, the floor is yours.
Great. So I'll start with the first question that was about the gender diversity. And I think that's really a challenge, right? Because we're only just getting some of those measures at a. I'm sorry, that's a challenge for efforts which are trying to get a global picture, because the data are so uneven across countries. We see a lot of countries, Canada, Australia, India, introducing measures into their data collections to better capture at least some more options, but we're still a long ways away from that. But maybe the work that Canada, the Statistics Canada does, will help provide guidelines or roadmap for others to build on. but in our index, we've added into the new index, we have a new indicator around legal frameworks, but we're not able, and in many cases, we're not even able to disaggregate, by men and women in the data. So the impact of environmental events, disasters, that's really hard to get even. We know that women are disproportionately affected, or disadvantaged populations are disproportionately affected, but it's hard to capture that in the data. So kudos to Augustine for the work that they've done in Kenya to try to unpack, start to unpack some of the social impacts. On the other question, it is like knowing your audience and like what do they need, right? So there's different tools for different people who are involved in different parts of the work in a way. And I just wanted to say that, it's almost like a dialectic, right? Because, we push so hard for outcome indicators in the SDGs. And I was involved in the education indicators. We pushed so hard for outcome indicators because no one was paying attention to learning. They were focused on these input indicators. And so we pushed so hard that now it's succeeded. So we have a really good outcomes-based framework, but then we can't measure progress because we don't have data for all of those outcome indicators yet for all countries. So for me, it's kind of thinking like, well, okay, we need that outcome indicator. It's absolutely essential, right? Because it comes to your point, Aaron, about, okay, well, yes, you have these laws in place, but are they really being implemented? And we see, in many cases that when we have the outcome indicators that they're not being implemented. So that's important to have both of those pieces. But I just think if we're measuring progress in the short term and we don't have the outcome indicators, that we do need to rely on other kinds of proxies, which might be, again, going back to some of those input indicators, which we, so vilified before because, the countries wouldn't let go of using enrollment rates or something like this. That it's kind of like a tension or a balance. And I think, it's about not losing sight. I think we exaggerate the outcome indicators because we really want people to change. We really want people to be able to collect that data. And so sometimes that looks like we're not valuing other sources of data which can provide, really valuable information.
Interestingly, if we've learned anything from the pandemic, that there's been renewed interest actually on input indicators, given that enrollment rates and dropout rates or stopout rates and children at risk, it's become clear that this is a much greater issue. And before I allowed Augustine to kind of response to another question that came up in the chat box, Albert, I wonder if you might very briefly in 1 minute kind of answer a query that I have, and that is that, in the work that you're doing around gender equality, it's clear that there's a long history of collecting information broken down by gender that has been incorporated in many different kind of data streams. I think that's much less the case in the area of climate change education and communication, not in terms of gender, but just generally, we don't have such a long history of data streams in this area that have been well worked and that can be mobilized even to develop a composite indicator. So, I think one of the big differences from the work you're doing and the work that we're involved in the MECCE project is, in some ways, not exactly starting from zero, but we have very much a vacuum of data, or at least desperate and fragmented sources that we're trying to bring together, which is obviously a very different kind of a challenge than the one that you faced.
Well, no, we do face the same challenge, right? Because we're working across sectors, and that the state of data, the state of the gender data ecosystem is really not good. It really, if it looks good in education, it's because the administrative data or the household survey data, allowed that disaggregation. But in other areas, it's not collected, and if it is collected, it's not reported always. I think one thing is good, and I don't know if I made this point about kind of looking outwards, to seeing what other groups that are facing the same challenges as MECCE are doing, and whether if there is the resources, right? But I think a great example is the Joint Monitoring Program for WASH. So and right now they're launching a lot of work around trying to get better indicators of gender, because it's too often measured by household consumption, right? Water or the use of energy. And so they're trying to unpack that and make an effort. But I think their strategy, their long-term strategy, is really informative and fascinating to look at how they came up with certain indicators that they could piggyback on surveys with, and keeping it very parsimonious, right? Not more than a couple items, but that would, kind of get them closer to their goal. But I found them to be really methodical about filling some of the data gaps and really kind of being very forward-looking about how to do that, right? Not just thinking about this year, but what are we building up to eventually. So I think there's some initiatives that could, provide some good lessons for, for practical things to, to achieve, to fill that, to address that gap in cost-effective ways.
Thanks very much, Albert. Augustine, in addition to the questions that I had previously posed in the chat box, we also, there were several members of the audience who were very interested in knowing a little bit more about the competing interest among stakeholders that you mentioned as being one of the challenges, and whether you could provide some additional details about that. So I invite your response to any or all of the questions that have been raised about your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aaron. And it's my pleasure now to respond to some of the questions. Yeah, I mentioned one of the challenge being competing interests among the stakeholders. Remember here, you are having all the stakeholders on board, the civil society, the private sector, the government institutions. And sometimes, remember, as I said, we engage the consultant to lead us in coming up with some of these indicators and actions. And some of the members of the task team, because you are drawing them from the civil society, from private sector, from government, some are consultants also, and they may want to start looking for work to consult. So those are some of the conflicting competing interests. You are here, you are also a businessman, and you want to engage a consultant, and you want to have it. So sometimes you have to manage some of those competing interests when you are using, or when you are actually engaging a number of stakeholders to develop a certain situation. So I think going forward, I want to request one of my colleagues. I have two colleagues with me in this room. I want to request one of my colleagues, Sheila Mbiru, to respond to the question of the choosing of stakeholders on qualitative and quantitative. Sheila, can you take the floor on my behalf?
Hello, everyone. My name is Sheila Mbiru, and I was a consultant that was leading this process of developing Kenya's National Climate Change Learning Strategy. So I will try and respond. I think there was one question about the indicators, preference for the indicators, whether they preferred the qualitative or quantitative indicators. And I think the preference was more for qualitative indicators more than quantitative indicators, looking at just reporting, or in terms of word statements, the case studies and reports. So we were looking at what we already have in terms of qualitative data, qualitative indicators. We had a challenge on quantitative indicators. In fact, in some cases, we were not able to get even baseline indicators, even after speaking to the stakeholders that we were engaging, and even some of the technical team members. We were not able to get a lot of the quantitative indicators. So we had more of the qualitative indicators. I hope that answers your question. And then in terms of the 6 action for empowerment elements, we had education, training, of course, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, and international cooperation. Which of them was challenging? I think each of them had their own, their own challenges. But in terms of Kenya and where we are at, education, we're trying to integrate climate change into the education sector at all levels, and that process is is currently underway. You know, the ministry has developed, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry has worked with the Ministry of Education to develop guidelines to support curriculum developers to integrate climate change at all levels, right from primary to tertiary levels, in response to the Climate Change Act that mandates climate change to be integrated in the education. So in terms of the other AACE elements, we had training. Of course, there's a lot of training that's going on at even the TVET, that's the vocational training, but definitely more need. There needs to be more training, more skills-based training in the area of climate change. And of course, in terms of awareness, there's still a low level of awareness, awareness on climate change, the different stakeholder groups. And in terms of public participation, even throughout the development of the learning strategy, we engaged all stakeholders, right from youth, women groups, persons with disability, faith-based groups, private sector, public sector, the civil society. We had a lot of engagement, but still found that even with that participation, we still found that we had not, we had not engaged enough. So we still need to do more in terms of public participation. And then definitely public access to information. As Mr. Kenduiwo mentioned, there's a national climate change learning strategy, which is a one-stop shop. We have, the portal, the climate change portal, but still we need to package this climate change information in different formats, in different languages, to reach different stakeholder groups. And so there's still a lot to be done. We have made strides, and this learning strategy will definitely support integration of these ACE elements. Thank you very much. I hope I've answered your questions.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Really appreciate your intervention here and some of the detail that you can provide. I really do think that the fact that you've been able to get cooperation across different ministries, all involved in this process, and kind of this is not an insignificant achievement. And I also want to underscore the importance of getting young people involved who are so much, very much their destiny is involved in this decision. And we can't really wait for the future, but really they should be actively involved in voicing their concerns and participation. So I think both of those are incredibly important achievements, in addition to the point you made about stakeholder consultation and getting so many different people to contribute to the process. So very interesting to see what's going on in Kenya, and much to be gained from the achievements there. So we'd like to thank both of the presenters, Albert and Augustine, and all of those of you that have joined for this very interesting discussion and presentation. I just want to mention that as we have recorded this, we're planning to put it on the MECCE website. We have our own network YouTube channel. If you haven't visited the MECCE website, I certainly would invite you to do so at mecce.ca. A lot of new material that has been uploaded in recent weeks, and much to be gained from looking at the website. We also have recently put together a blog post in this area about the role of indicators in advancing global climate change education, which you can find on the website. And I believe that my colleague will place the link to that blog post for you to take a look at. And finally, before we end, just to let you know that the MECCE project is currently inviting proposals for funded case studies of climate communication education, and the information about how to submit and what kinds of proposals we're looking for can be found on the website. So again, I'd like to thank very much our two speakers, to all members of the audience, and appreciate the fact that we've had a very engaging and hopefully enlightening webinar here. So be safe, be well, and we'll be in touch in the time to come. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Aaron. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
you.
Yes.